42 On the morning of December 7, 1941, Commander Minoru Gender stood on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, 230 miles north of Oahu, observing the second wave of Japanese planes returning from Pearl Harbor. The task force had departed Hitakapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26, maintaining strict radio silence for the entire 12-day crossing of the North Pacific. 6 aircraft carriers moving in formation, Akagi, Kaga, Sorya, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 8 tankers accompanied them. The largest carrier strike group ever assembled. The carriers rolled gently on the Pacific swell. The morning air carried the scent of aviation fuel, heated metal from recovered aircraft engines, and salt spray. Around Gender, pilots and deck crews were celebrating. Men embraced one another, shouting and laughing with the relief and euphoria that follows surviving combat. The tension that had gripped the force for nearly 2 weeks had broken. They had succeeded. They had struck the Americans and survived. The assault had been more destructive than anyone anticipated. 4 American battleships were sunk outright. The Arizona had detonated with such force that debris showered Ford Island a quarter-mile away. The Oklahoma had capsized entirely, rolling 150 degrees to port, trapping over 400 men in its hull. West Virginia and California had sunk to the harbor floor, their superstructures still visible above water, though their hulls shattered by torpedoes. 4 more battleships suffered such severe damage they appeared total losses. Nevada had attempted to get underway during the strike but had to be beached to prevent sinking in the harbor channel. Pennsylvania rested in dry dock, damaged but reparable. Maryland and Tennessee were blocked by capsized ships, their decks shredded by bomb hits. 18 vessels in total destroyed or crippled. 2,403 Americans dead, hundreds more injured. Japan had lost only 29 aircraft out of 353 launched, 90 fighters, 5 torpedo bombers, and 15 dive bombers, losses of just over 8%. By any measure, it was a decisive triumph. Commander Mitsuo Fuida, who had led the strike, landed on Akagi's deck and reported to Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo that the mission was entirely successful. The American Pacific Fleet had been crippled, and the path was clear for Japanese expansion across Southeast Asia. Pilots were jubilant yet exhausted, talking over one another about what they had witnessed. But Gender remained apart from the celebration. At 37, he was one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most brilliant aviation tacticians. He had spent 11 months since January 1941, working under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, planning every aspect of the operation, training schedules, attack formations, target priorities, and ordnance loads. The calculations running through his mind told a different story than the jubilant scene suggested. A story of logistics, fuel, and industrial capacity. A story that meant Japan had won a devastating tactical victory while simultaneously ensuring its strategic defeat. The problem was not the battleships. Everyone focused on the battleships, these massive steel fortresses burning and sinking in the harbor. But Gender understood that battleships were becoming obsolete. The future of naval warfare belonged to aircraft carriers and submarines, not slow-moving gun platforms vulnerable to aircraft they could never intercept. The real problem, the fatal flaw, was what the Japanese had not struck. 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil remained in above-ground storage tanks on the eastern side of Pearl Harbor Naval Base. 49 enormous cylindrical tanks, divided among 3 facilities built over decades, contained the entire fuel supply for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The lower tank farm, built between 1913 and 1923, held roughly 1,400,000 barrels in 22 tanks of varying sizes. The original 5 tanks, built in 1913, contained 35,000 to 50,000 barrels each. Additional tanks added in 1923 increased the capacity by 17 tanks at 50,000 barrels each. The middle tank farm contained about 500,000 barrels in 10 tanks. The upper farm, the largest, held approximately 2,500,000 barrels in 17 tanks, each with 150,000 barrel capacity. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later note that all 4.5 million barrels were vulnerable to 50 caliber bullets, let alone bombs. The tanks had been designed for peacetime efficiency, not wartime resilience above ground, clustered to minimize piping, and optimized for operations rather than survivability. Reconnaissance had revealed them clearly. Teiko Yoshiawa, using the alias Tadashi Morimura from the Japanese consulate in Honolulu, had spent months observing Pearl Harbor, tracking ship movements, counting aircraft, noting dry docks and repair facilities, and reporting weekly through coded telegraphs. The Japanese planners were aware of the fuel storage. The tanks were highly vulnerable, made of thin steel plate meant to contain liquid at atmospheric pressure, not resist military attacks. Even a 500-pound armor-piercing bomb could rupture a tank entirely. Fuel oil is less volatile than gasoline. It doesn't explode spectacularly but burns fiercely and persistently. One ruptured tank could ignite a chain reaction, spreading fire across the entire farm and destroying all 4.5 million barrels. The Pacific Fleet carried only about 760,000 barrels of fuel in its oilers and ship bunkers combined, less than 1/6 of Pearl Harbor's storage. Within the first 9 days after the attack, the fleet used nearly all its seaborne fuel for search operations and securing approaches to Hawaii. Without the shore-based tanks, the fleet would have been immobilized. Destruction of the tanks would have forced a retreat to the west coast, doubling fuel consumption just to reach operational areas in the western Pacific. Every warship's effective range would have been halved, crippling American operations west of Midway. Interference with Japanese advances in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies would have been impossible for 12 to 18 months. Rebuilding storage at Pearl Harbor would have taken years, as constructing 4.5 million barrels of fuel tanks requires engineering, construction, testing, and supporting infrastructure, pumping stations, pipelines, loading facilities, fire suppression systems, all under wartime conditions. Yet the Japanese planes never targeted the oil tanks. Not a single bomb fell on them. The attack plan prioritized battleships, dramatic, visible targets, but ignored the facilities critical for sustained naval operations: carriers, submarines, repair yards, dry docks, and, most importantly, fuel storage. This was no accident. It stemmed from fundamental miscalculations about modern naval warfare, fuel logistics, tanker capacity, and the duration Japan could sustain a conflict without American oil imports. Captain Kamito Kurushima, senior staff officer to Admiral Yamamoto, known for his extraordinary intellect, sometimes worked unclothed, claiming clothing distracted him from strategy. He subsisted almost entirely on rice and could recite from memory the fuel capacities and cruising ranges of every major ship in both navies. In early 1941, Japanese naval planners faced a critical calculation. Could Japan sustain a war against the United States? The answer depended entirely on oil. Japan imported 90% of its petroleum. In peacetime, Japan consumed approximately 32 to 37 million barrels per year for all purposes, military and civilian combined. Most of that oil came from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. The American oil embargo imposed on July 26, 1941 following Japanese occupation of southern French Indochina had cut off Japan's primary supply source. Britain and the Dutch government in exile immediately followed with their own embargoes. Japan was suddenly cut off from more than 80% of its oil imports. By September 1941, Japan had approximately 50 million barrels in strategic reserves distributed between Navy stocks, Army stocks, and civilian reserves mandated by 1934 legislation. The Imperial Japanese Navy alone was consuming approximately 2,900 barrels per hour during routine peacetime operations. That translated to approximately 69,600 barrels per day or 25.4 million barrels per year just for the Navy. Add Army consumption and civilian needs in Japan was burning through its entire 50 million barrel reserve at an alarming rate. Without new sources of oil, Japan would run out of fuel for military operations sometime in 1943. The nation faced two choices: capitulate to American demands, which would require withdrawing from China and abandoning the entire Greater East Asia prosperity sphere, or go to war to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies before reserves ran out. The Imperial Japanese Navy chose war. But that choice required answering the fundamental question: could Japan win a war against the United States before running out of fuel? That calculation involved three critical assumptions. Each assumption seemed reasonable. Each was supported by historical precedent, military doctrine, or intelligence analysis. Each proved catastrophically wrong. Assumption: the war would be short. Japanese leaders believed the United States would negotiate a settlement after 6 to 8 months of fighting. Americans were accustomed to comfort, unwilling to accept heavy casualties. After initial defeats, they would agree to a compromise recognizing Japanese control of Southeast Asia. This Assumption meant fuel consumption calculations only needed to account for a brief campaign. Long-term sustainability did not matter. Second assumption, Japanese naval operations would follow the decisive battle doctrine that had defined strategy since the 1905 victory at Tsushima. The combined fleet would remain mostly in home waters, waiting for the American Pacific Fleet to steam west. There would be one or two major fleet engagements where Japanese forces would destroy the American fleet in climactic surface actions. This meant most Japanese ships would spend most of their time at anchor consuming minimal fuel. Only a small percentage of the fleet would be actively operating at any time. Fuel consumption would be predictable, manageable, relatively low. Third assumption, capturing the Dutch East Indies oil fields would solve Japan's supply problem permanently. The oil fields in Borneo, Sumatra, and Java produced 65 million barrels per year in 1940. Japanese planners estimated military consumption at 35 to 40 million barrels annually. Capturing those fields would provide more than enough oil to meet Japan's needs indefinitely. Based on these assumptions, Japanese planners concluded they could fight and win. The mathematics appeared sound. The strategy seemed viable. In September 1941, with 15 million barrels in reserve and the prospect of capturing 65 million barrels per year of production capacity, the numbers suggested Japan could sustain a war. But every assumption was wrong, and the mathematical errors built into those assumptions would doom Japan before the first shot was fired. The war was not short. The United States did not negotiate after 6 months. Americans responded to Pearl Harbor, not with defeatism, but with furious determination. President Franklin Roosevelt's declaration that December 7th would live in infamy united the country. American industrial capacity shifted to total war production. Shipyards that had built merchant vessels began building warships. Factories that produced automobiles began producing tanks and aircraft. The entire economy mobilized. The conflict would last 3 years and 8 months, not 6 months. Japanese naval operations did not follow the decisive battle pattern. The Pacific War became something entirely different from what Japanese planners anticipated. It involved continuous operations across vast distances, carrier task forces conducting raids on enemy bases thousands of miles from home, submarines operating on extended patrols, hunting convoys, amphibious assaults on scattered islands requiring massive escort forces, destroyers constantly shuttling between bases escorting supply convoys. Every operation required constant movement, constant maneuvering, constant fuel consumption at combat intensity rates. Consider the scale of operations. A single destroyer operating at 15 knots cruising speed consumed approximately 100 tons of fuel oil per day. That same destroyer conducting high-speed operations at 25 to 30 knots consumed 300 to 400 tons per day. Combat operations were never conducted at cruising speed. They were conducted at maximum or near maximum speed. That meant fuel consumption rates 3 to 4 times higher than PCE planning assumptions. A destroyer on a combat deployment might spend 2 weeks traveling to an operational area, 1 week conducting combat operations, then 2 weeks returning. During the combat week, it would consume as much fuel as it normally consumed in 3 to 4 weeks of peacetime cruising. The planning assumptions that estimated fuel based on average cruising speeds were completely divorced from reality. Multiply this across the fleet. By mid-1942, Japan was operating dozens of destroyers simultaneously on various missions, each one burning 3 to 4 times the planned fuel consumption. Add cruisers, which consumed even more. Add carriers and their air groups. Add battleships, massive fuel hogs that burned hundreds of tons per day, even at moderate speeds. Add submarines. Add fleet oilers, which consumed fuel while delivering fuel. The total consumption quickly exceeded planning estimates by enormous margins. The actual numbers told the story. Japanese military consumption in Fiscal 1942, which ran from April 1942 through March 1943, totaled 41.79 million barrels. Planning estimates had assumed 35 to 40 million barrels. The actual consumption was at the high end of estimates during a year when major operations were still ramping up. As the war intensified, consumption would only increase. Fiscal 1943 consumption reached 43.999 million barrels. This was during the height of Japanese operations in the Solomons, New Guinea and the Central Pacific. The assumptions that fuel consumption would be manageable and predictable proved completely wrong. Japan was burning oil at rates that exhausted reserves far faster than anticipated. Capturing the Dutch East Indies oil fields did not solve the supply problem. When Japanese forces swept through Borneo, Sumatra, and Java in early 1942, they found the oil infrastructure extensively sabotaged. Allied defenders, knowing they could not hold the territory, had systematically destroyed as much production capacity as possible before retreating or surrendering. At Balik Paparan in Borneo, one of the richest oil-producing regions in Southeast Asia, Dutch engineers had demolished key facilities before the Japanese arrived. They blew up pumping stations with dynamite. They destroyed storage tanks. They set wells on fire, creating massive blazes that burned for weeks. They dumped concrete down drill holes, rendering wells inoperable. They removed critical components from refinery equipment and threw them into rivers or buried them. They sabotaged electrical systems and damaged pipelines. The sabotage was not complete. Japanese forces moved quickly enough to capture some facilities relatively intact, but overall damage was substantial. Even facilities that appeared intact often had subtle damage, missing parts, damaged seals, compromised safety systems, equipment that looked functional but would fail under operation. Restoring production required skilled technicians Japan did not have in sufficient numbers. The Netherlands and Britain had developed sophisticated petroleum engineering expertise over decades of operating these fields. Japanese petroleum industry, by comparison, was tiny. Japan's domestic oil production from fields in Akita and Nagata totaled only about 3 million barrels annually. The entire Japanese petroleum engineering sector was perhaps one-tenth the size of what the Dutch and British had deployed in the East Indies. Most Dutch and British petroleum engineers had been evacuated before Japanese forces arrived. Those who remained and were captured were imprisoned rather than put to work, using enemy nationals to operate. Critical war industries raised security concerns. Language barriers created complications. Japanese military authorities distrusted the loyalties of captured personnel. Japan had to send petroleum engineers from the home islands to operate the captured fields, but finding qualified people was difficult. Universities had not trained petroleum engineers in large numbers because Japan had virtually no domestic oil industry. Mining engineers could be retrained for some tasks. Chemical engineers understood refinery processes, but the specialized knowledge required to operate tropical oil fields efficiently, to maintain production without damaging reservoirs, to solve problems that arose during operations, that knowledge was scarce. Equipment was even more problematic than personnel. Oil field equipment is specialized, heavy, difficult to transport, and impossible to improvise. Drilling rigs weigh hundreds of tons and require specialized transportation. Refinery components are precisely manufactured and cannot be easily replaced. Pumping equipment must match specific well characteristics. Pipelines must be properly sized and routed. Storage tanks must meet capacity requirements. Japan needed to ship replacement equipment from the home islands, but Japanese merchant shipping was already stretched thin. The same ships that needed to carry oil from the captured fields to Japan also needed to carry equipment to those fields. Ships traveling south carried drilling equipment, refinery components, pumping machinery. Ships traveling north carried crude oil and refined products. But there were never enough ships to do both adequately. Moreover, merchant ships were increasingly targeted by American submarines. Every ship sunk carrying equipment south meant production in the oil fields could not be restored. Every ship sunk carrying oil north meant less fuel reached Japan. The submarines created a perfect trap. Japan needed equipment to restore production and ships to transport oil. But the same submarine campaign that sunk oil tankers also sunk the equipment vessels needed to restore production capacity. Production in the captured territories struggled to reach pre-war levels. In 1940, before the Japanese invasion, the Dutch East Indies produced 65 million barrels. In 1942, after Japanese occupation, production reached only 25.9 million barrels. That was less than 40% of pre-war production achieved despite major efforts to restore facilities. The shortfall of nearly 40 million barrels represented oil that did not exist, that could not be captured, that could not help Japan win the war. Japanese planners had assumed they would quickly restore full production. They assumed 65 million barrels per year would be available. They based the entire war strategy on that assumption. But actual production was less than half that level. In 1943, production improved to 49.6 million barrels as restoration efforts continued and more facilities came back online. That was 76% of pre-war levels, a significant achievement. But by then, the tanker shortage had become critical. The oil fields were producing, but the oil could not reach Japan. This was the third catastrophic error in Japanese planning. Japanese strategists had not adequately calculated how much shipping capacity would be required to transport oil from Southeast Asia to Japan, and more critically how vulnerable that shipping would be to American submarine warfare. The geography of the problem was unforgiving. The distance from Borneo to Japan is approximately 2,000 nautical miles. From Sumatra, it is even farther. A typical Japanese tanker in 1941 had a cargo capacity of about 10,000 tons dead weight, which translated to roughly 75,000 barrels of oil. At a cruising speed of 11 to 12 knots, which was economical for tanker operations, the round trip from Borneo to Japan took approximately 4 weeks, including loading and unloading time. That meant a single tanker could theoretically make about 13 trips per year, delivering approximately 975,000 barrels annually if it operated continuously without losses or major delays. To transport 49 million barrels, the amount produced in captured territories in 1943, Japan needed approximately 50 tankers in continuous operation dedicated solely to oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies. That did not include tankers needed for moving oil between Japanese ports, tankers supporting naval operations at sea, tankers carrying aviation fuel, or tankers that would inevitably be damaged, under repair, or sunk. In December 1941, Japan possessed approximately 49 ocean-going tankers, suitable for long-range oil transport totaling about 500,000 gross tons. That number included both Navy tankers and civilian tankers requisitioned for military use. It was barely sufficient for peacetime needs when oil could be purchased from nearby sources and domestic production supplemented imports. For war with all oil coming from distant conquered territories, it was catastrophically inadequate. Building new tankers required shipyard capacity and construction time. A tanker took approximately 8 to 10 months to build from coal-laying to delivery. But Japanese shipyards were already operating at maximum capacity building warships. Every month shipyards were launching destroyers, submarines, cruisers, aircraft carriers. The Navy, General Staff and the government prioritized combat vessels over support vessels. Tankers were unglamorous. They did not sink enemy ships. They did not win battles. They just carried oil. The priority always went to warships. Between December 1941 and December 1943, Japanese shipyards focused on warship construction. Some tankers were built, but not nearly enough to replace losses. Meanwhile, American submarines were systematically destroying Japan's tanker fleet in what became one of the most successful submarine campaigns in naval history. American submarines operated under a doctrine specifically targeting Japanese logistics. Tankers were priority targets. Every tanker sunk represented thousands of barrels of oil that would never reach Japan. Submarines lurked along tanker routes between the Dutch East Indies and Japan. They waited near choke points. Luzon Strait between. The Philippines in Formosa became known as a submarine killing ground. Tankers had to pass through to reach Japan from the south. Submarines waited there in ambush. The impact was devastating. Every tanker sunk meant less oil transported, but the effects cascaded beyond simple tonnage losses. Each tanker lost meant remaining tankers had to make more trips to transport the same amount of oil. More trips meant more time at sea. More time at sea meant more exposure to submarine attack. It created a death spiral where each loss made the remaining tankers more vulnerable. Furthermore, tanker crews became increasingly demoralized as losses mounted. Sailing on a tanker became one of the most dangerous jobs in the Japanese merchant marine. Tankers were slow, poorly armed, often sailed with inadequate escorts because destroyers were needed elsewhere. Crews knew they were priority targets. The psychological toll affected operations even when tankers survived their voyages. Tanker captains began taking circuitous routes to avoid known submarine operating areas. Routes that should have taken 4 weeks began taking 5 or 6 weeks as captains zigzagged, hugged coastlines, waited in protected anchorages for escorts. Longer voyages meant fewer trips per year. Fewer trips meant less oil transported even by surviving tankers. The submarine threat reduced effective tanker capacity even beyond actual sinkings. By late 1942, the tanker shortage had become critical. Japanese oil imports began declining. Not because production in the conquered territories was falling, but because the shipping to transport that oil was disappearing. Oil sat in storage tanks in Borneo and Sumatra with no ships available to move it. The submarine campaign had created a transportation choke point that strangled Japanese oil supplies. By April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the mathematical reality of Japan's fuel crisis was becoming undeniable. Japanese oil reserves had dropped from 50 million barrels in September 1941 to approximately 38 million barrels. The decline of 12 million barrels in 7 months represented a burn rate far exceeding PCE projections. The Navy alone was consuming approximately 2.4 million barrels per month, significantly above planning estimates that had assumed 1.5 to 2 million barrels monthly. Admiral Yamamoto received detailed reports about the fuel situation in May 1942 as he prepared for the operation against Midway. The numbers were alarming. At current consumption rates, even with optimistic assumptions about oil production in captured territories and successful tanker voyages, Japan would exhaust its oil reserves sometime in 1943, possibly as early as mid-1943. If consumption remained at current levels or increased further. The Naval General Staff held a series of emergency meetings in Tokyo throughout the summer and fall of 1942 to discuss the fuel crisis. Minutes from these meetings reveal growing concern and increasingly desperate proposals. Every solution discussed had fundamental problems that made implementation difficult or impossible. One proposal was to dramatically increase tanker construction, build 50 new tankers immediately, double or triple the transport capacity. But Japanese shipyards were already operating at maximum capacity around the clock. Building 50 tankers meant not building 50 destroyers or 10 cruisers or 2 aircraft carriers. Combat vessels were needed to fight the war. Choosing tankers over warships meant accepting reduced combat capability. Moreover, tankers took 8 to 10 months to build. Ships begun in late 1942 would not enter service until mid to late 1943. At the earliest. That might be too late if reserves were exhausted before the new tankers became available. Another proposal was to reduce operational tempo across all forces, order all units to minimize fuel consumption, reduce training flights, limit naval exercises. Keep ships in port unless operationally necessary. But reducing operations meant ceding initiative to the Americans. It meant allowing enemy forces to advance without opposition. It meant watching American power grow while Japanese forces sat idle. Every week of reduced operations was a week the Americans used to build more ships, train more pilots, Move closer to Japan. Trading fuel conservation for operational weakness was trading one form of defeat for another. A third proposal which was actually implemented was to move major fleet units closer to the oil source, base the battleships and large carriers at Singapore or in the waters around Borneo and the Dutch East Indies. Ships stationed near the oil fields could refuel directly without requiring tanker transport to Japan. This saves tanker capacity for other purposes and kept the fleet fueled. But stationing the fleet thousands of miles from Japan created its own problems. The decisive battles were happening in the Central Pacific, at Midway in June 1942, at Guadalcanal starting in August 1942, at Tarawa in November 1943, at the Marianas in June 1944. These battles were being fought 2,000 to 3,000 miles from Singapore. The ships that were supposed to defend Japan were sitting near Borneo because that was where the fuel was. By the time orders could be sent, fleets could sortie, and ships could steam thousands of miles to the battle area. Engagements were often decided. The American advance continued while Japanese battleships sat idle near the oil fields. A fourth proposal was to use lower-rate fuels to conserve refined products. Tankers could carry unrefined Borneo crude directly to naval bases rather than carrying refined bunker fuel. Ships could burn the crude directly. This was actually attempted. Japanese warships in 1943 and 1944 increasingly burned unrefined crude oil as bunker fuel. The consequences were predictable. Crude oil contains sulfur, salt, sediments, and other contaminants that refined bunker fuel has removed. Burning crude caused rapid accumulation of deposits in boilers and fireboxes. Boiler tubes became clogged and less efficient. Heat transfer degraded. Ships burning crude developed maintenance problems at accelerated rates. Boiler cleaning, normally done every few months, had to be done every few weeks. Some ships suffered boiler failures, leaving them dead in the water, requiring tows to repair facilities. Using crude oil saved transportation capacity, but degraded fleet readiness and created long-term maintenance problems. A fifth proposal was to develop synthetic fuel production in Japan and Manchuria. Germany had successfully developed synthetic fuel from coal. Japan could do the same, but synthetic fuel production required massive industrial investment, specialized equipment, and coal of specific quality. Building synthetic fuel plants took years. The technology was complex, and Japan lacked the expertise Germany had developed over 2 decades of research. Small-scale experiments were attempted, but never reached industrial production levels that could meaningfully offset the oil shortage. Synthetic fuel remained a theoretical solution that could not be implemented quickly enough to matter. By September 1942, Japanese consumption was averaging approximately 3.7 million barrels per month, while imports from captured territories were falling short of that level. The deficit came from reserves. Every month, Japan's strategic stockpile shrank. The Navy estimated that at current trends, reserves would drop below 10 million barrels by mid-1943. Below 10 million, the Navy considered reserves inadequate for sustained operations. That was the crisis point. The core problem was arithmetic that admitted no resolution. Japan required roughly 40 million barrels per year at a minimum to maintain military operations at the intensity needed to confront the United States. After factoring in submarine losses and transport inefficiencies, Japan could import at most 20 to 25 million barrels per year from occupied territories. Domestic output contributed only 3 million barrels annually. Synthetic fuel added negligible amounts. There was a structural shortfall of 12 to 17 million barrels annually. No combination of efficiency measures, operational constraints, or technical adaptations could close a deficit that large. The calculations were unavoidable. By mid-1943, Japanese oil reserves had dwindled to around 15 million barrels, less than a third of pre-war levels. American submarines had decimated the tanker fleet. Surviving ships navigated dangerous waters along circuitous routes, burning much of their cargo as fuel for propulsion. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carriers operated at the extreme edge of their fuel range. Maneuvering freely was impossible because every unnecessary mile consumed irreplaceable fuel. American carriers, in contrast, enjoyed virtually unlimited fuel, supported by a massive logistics chain of fleet oilers that allowed total operational freedom. The difference was not courage or skill, it was arithmetic. America had the oil and the tankers to deliver it. Japan had neither. By late 1944, Japanese oil imports had collapsed almost entirely. Most tankers were sunk. The few remaining could barely operate. Many vessels sat idle with empty fuel bunkers, unable to sortie even when ordered. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japanese forces executed a desperate mission that consumed most of their remaining fuel reserves. The operation was not intended as a one-way mission, but severe shortages meant ships could barely return to port. The fleet was effectively immobilized by fuel depletion. In April 1945, the battleship Yamato embarked on her final sortie to Okinawa. Operation Tango was explicitly conceived as a suicide mission. Orders specified minimal fuel, just enough to reach Okinawa, where the ship would beach and operate as a stationary gun platform. Local base commanders at Tokuyama secretly supplied more fuel than orders required, about 60% of full capacity rather than a one-way allotment. This act of defiance reflected how controversial the mission was, even within the Navy. Yet even 60% fuel was likely insufficient for a return journey. Yamato was sunk by American aircraft on April 7, 1945. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, oil reserves were effectively depleted. The combined fleet was immobilized. Most major warships had been sunk, and those that survived remained in port with empty bunkers. Oil fields in the Dutch East Indies were still producing, but the crude sat in storage tanks in Borneo because no tankers remained to transport it. Japan had fought the entire war under a fuel deficit it could never surmount, a deficit that existed before the conflict began. A deficit that was predictable and calculable from the mathematics of consumption versus supply. Admiral Yamamoto understood this from the start. On January 7, 1941, before planning for Pearl Harbor had even begun, Yamamoto wrote to Navy Minister Koshiro Oikawa. In his letter, he stated clearly that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. American industrial capacity vastly exceeded Japan's. American oil production dwarfed Japan's domestic output. If the war lasted more than 6 to 8 months, defeat was inevitable. Yamamoto wrote that only a rapid knockout strike might shock the Americans into negotiating, but even this was improbable because Americans historically did not capitulate after initial losses, they became more resolute. Yamamoto never believed Pearl Harbor would secure a decisive strategic result. The numbers did not support Japanese victory. Yet Yamamoto was constrained by institutional pressures that shaped Japanese planning. He could express doubts privately, make pessimistic predictions to trusted colleagues, but he could not publicly refuse to plan the attack. Doing so would be seen as insubordination, disloyalty, and undermining national unity. His career would have ended, and someone else would have been appointed. So Yamamoto executed Pearl Harbor to the best of his ability, knowing it would likely fail strategically, hoping the Americans might react differently than history predicted. On December 7, as Commander Minoru Genda watched the second wave return to Kaga's deck, he understood all of this. He knew the fuel tanks had not been targeted. He knew they should have been. Leaving them intact was a tactical error that cost Japan months of operational advantage. But Genda also knew a deeper truth. Even if the fuel tanks had been destroyed, even if Pearl Harbor had been rendered useless, even if the Pacific Fleet had been forced back to California, the arithmetic still did not work. Japan still lacked sufficient oil to win. Fuel consumption rates remained too high. Tanker capacity too low. Captured oil fields could not meet demand. Destroying Pearl Harbor's fuel tanks might have delayed American operations by 6 to 12 months, but it would not have altered the outcome. The result was determined by mathematics that existed before the first bomb fell. Japan required roughly 40 million barrels of oil per year to sustain the war effort against the United States. Access to all sources combined, including imports and domestic production, totaled only 25 to 30 million barrels per year. The shortfall was 10 to 15 million barrels annually. No amount of tactical brilliance, combat spirit, or superior training could overcome a deficit of that scale. Industrial wars cannot be waged without industrial resources. Naval operations cannot continue without fuel, and arithmetic cannot be wished away because the numbers are politically inconvenient. That was the fatal flaw that doomed Japan, not focusing on fuel tanks at Pearl Harbor, not halting after 2 waves instead of a third. The fatal error was initiating a war based on assumptions about fuel consumption, oil production, and tanker capacity that were demonstrably wrong, assumptions made by planners prioritizing what leadership wanted to hear over what calculations actually showed. Many Japanese officers understood the constraints, but institutional culture stifled dissent. Officers who challenged approved plans were seen as disloyal. Career advancement favored agreement, not truth-telling. Those who understood the mathematics stayed silent. Those who didn't made decisions. Japan went to war with fuel projections that underestimated actual needs, oil production estimates that overestimated captured fields, and tanker calculations ignoring inevitable submarine losses. The story of Japan's fatal oil miscalculations is not just about petroleum, it is about institutional culture, political pressures overriding rational analysis, officers who knew uncomfortable truths but stayed silent, leaders choosing comforting illusions over facts. Captain Kato Kurushima, the brilliant staff officer who worked naked while eating only rice, survived the war. Whether he was ever formally interviewed is unclear, but the failure of Japanese strategic planning is evident. Assumptions were wrong, calculations incorrect, consequences catastrophic. Commander Minoru Genda also survived, later serving as Chief of Staff of Japan's Air Self-Defense Force, 1959 to 1962, and entering politics. In interviews, he consistently stated that even if Pearl Harbor had been executed perfectly, Japan still would have lost. The industrial and resource imbalance was simply too great. Admiral Yamamoto did not live to see defeat. He was killed on April 18, 1943, when American fighters intercepted his aircraft over Bougainville. American codebreakers had deciphered Japanese naval communications and learned his flight plan. The mission was personally approved by President Roosevelt. Yamamoto died knowing the fuel crisis was unfolding as he had predicted, knowing that no tactical victories could overcome the arithmetic of oil consumption versus supply. The core lesson is simple but profound. Wars are not won by courage alone, by superior tactics, or better training. Wars are won by logistics, industrial capacity, resources, and the unglamorous arithmetic of fuel available versus fuel needed. Japan needed 40 million barrels per year. It had 25 million. The war was lost in those numbers. Every battle, every sacrifice, every tactical feat was merely the execution of mathematical inevitability. When nations ignore arithmetic because it conflicts with political objectives, when institutions suppress analysis that challenges plans, when leaders believe comforting falsehoods instead of facts, the result is not just defeat, it is catastrophe.